Hello, and welcome to this webinar on capstone projects for accounting students. So in your professional lives, there may be times where you're made responsible for a project where the desired outcome is clear, and you may be given little to no direction on where to start or precisely how the client wants you to get there. So when this happens, you may be asking yourself, what exactly is being asked of me? Where do I find tools and resources to help? Who needs to do what in order to accomplish the goal? When is the outcome expected? Why am I doing this? And how do I proceed? So I hope that this webinar helps alleviate some of that initial stress by providing tips on how to approach a project when you're not sure where to start. So a little bit about me. My name is Scott Peters, and I'm hosting today's webinar. And I'm currently a CPA student studying to obtain my designation. I graduated from Ontario Tech University class of 2020 with a Bachelor of Commerce majoring in accounting. I then went on to complete the graduate diploma program in accounting, also at Ontario Tech, and graduated class of 2021. I'm currently a staff accountant at Turner Moore LLP, a licensed public accounting firm with offices across Southern Ontario from Windsor to Ottawa. Before returning to school as a mature student, I was an area manager in the specialty retail sector for a major US-based manufacturer of children's apparel. And my hobbies include skiing, camping, painting, sketching, reading, and listening to podcasts. And as I said, I'll be walking you through today's webinar on capstone projects for accounting students. On today's agenda, we will start by discussing the importance of having the right mindset going into a project and what that looks like. Next, I'll provide some tips on making a robust plan that will help deliver a comprehensive solution to your client. Following that, I'll discuss some of the tools, resources, and methods that you can use along with other considerations before the actual work even really begins on the project. Then I'll provide some thoughts and best practices on the implementation stage where the work is actually done and talk about what a successful completion should look like. And for those familiar with CPA Canada and their education programs, you'll notice that our agenda is pretty similar to what is referred to as the CPA way, which is the model that CPA Canada uses for case writing and for practical application of real problems. The CPA way consists of the 5 following steps. 1, having a CPA mindset, assess the situation, analyze major issues, conclude and advise, and communicate. And again, our discussion or webinar today will roughly follow this same format. Okay, so let's take a bit of a deeper dive into what it means when we talk about having the right mindset going into a project, as well as maintaining the right mindset throughout the project to completion. So when we talk about having the right mindset, specifically from the perspective of an accountant or a potential CPA, it's important to note that there are 5 key principles of ethical standards for CPAs, and they include objectivity, integrity and due care, competence, confidentiality, and professional behavior. The CPA also has what they call enabling competencies, which are more soft skills that CPAs are required to possess. Some of those enabling competencies include professional and ethical behavior, problem solving and decision making, communication, self-management, and teamwork and leadership skills. The CPA also has technical competencies, and the technical competencies are exactly as they are named, which is to say that they are the more technical or hard skills that are required of CPAs. And those technical competencies are financial reporting, management accounting, finance, taxation, audit and assurance, and strategy and governance. So in the webinar today, I'm specifically going to talk about objectivity and the importance of maintaining throughout a project. Talk about professionalism and ethics and as they would relate to capstone projects, teamwork and leadership, and also talk a bit about the importance of adaptability and integration. And in this case, specifically what I'm referring to when I talk about integration from a CPA's perspective is the ability to link one particular issue to many different CPA technical competencies. So a kind of basic example of this would be if a client asks you to research the viability of an investment. So from a finance perspective, you're going to say do an NPV or the IRR, calculate to determine whether or not the client should go ahead with the investment. You may also want to consider the financial reporting side. So if they do go ahead with the investment, how would that be reported on their balance sheet? And how would income from that investment be reported on their income statement or through the balance sheet? And then again, how is that income being taxed? So you can see how one issue or one kind of problem can translate through multiple different of the technical competencies. So again, when we talk about integration, it's talking about the ability to really formulate a really robust solution for your client, where again, you're not just solving the problem or answering the question as to whether the investment is viable, you're also considering those additional impacts to the business from, again, a financial reporting side, taxation, strategy and governance, whatever it may be. Okay, so first I'll discuss the concept of objectivity and the importance of maintaining it throughout the completion of the project. It's really important to remember that preconceived ideas may limit or bias your analyses and conclusions. Now, in a few minutes, I'll speak a bit about some assumptions that might be required, and it's important to note that those assumptions are different from the type of preconceived notions that I'm talking about now. A really quick example would be if a client asked you to prepare a 5-year pro forma financial statement. You're going to have to make assumptions about sales growth, how assets are being used, and other considerations like that. So being aware of any implicit and explicit biases you may have will help you set aside preconceived notions. As an example, if a client asked me to analyze a potential investment of a plot of land where they planned on building a campground for families, geared toward families with young kids. So, as I said before, I love camping, and families with young kids is my demographic. So, I may be inclined to find evidence that supports investing in this plot of land and kind of ignore evidence that suggests that it might not be the best investment for this particular client. So again, making sure that even that I've considered that bias will help and provide balance to your analysis. Again, by being aware of the idea that I might ignore evidence suggesting it's a bad investment will kind of automatically help me seek out evidence to the contrary. Similarly, presume the client is a partnership. One partner wants to invest in the campground and one does not. The partner who wants to invest in the campground was born in the same small town as I was. I may have an implicit bias toward confirming that the partnership should invest. And again, just by stopping to think about what biases could exist will help you force yourself to see problems through a different lens and consider solutions that maybe are different from your gut reaction. And finally, seeking viewpoints and perspective from all group members will ensure that you're gaining a more complete understanding of the problem and potential solutions. So again, I had mentioned before the five key principles of ethical standards for CPAs are objectivity, integrity and due care, competence, confidentiality, and professional behavior. So it's important to remember when we're thinking about professionalism and ethics, the importance of communicating professionally, both orally and written, with team members and with your client. Now, I know in some cases for capstone projects, students will actually be given non-disclosure agreements or similar documents. So in that case, confidentiality and the needs for that will be a lot more explicit. In other cases, it might not be as explicit. And when we're talking about confidentiality as it relates to business projects in general, I would always say you want to operate on a need to know basis, which is to say that unless someone needs to know about the problem that the client has presented you with, then they probably, it's not necessarily something that you should be sharing if they don't need to know. Obviously, it's different if you're reaching out to an instructor or kind of a third party for advice, where again, we're allowed by your agreement with your client. But making sure again that you're considering the need and appropriateness of any conversation as it relates to confidentiality with your client. Again, you want to make sure that you're always self-assessing your work performance, um, being on top of the project and making sure that you yourself are holding up your end of the bargain and being hard on yourself will again help cement your reputation in your group as someone who works hard, as opposed to someone who doesn't care about the quality of their work or how they present to either the client or other group members. And then the other thing to consider, again, kind of talking about really big picture here, but considering the needs of the community at large where appropriate. And again, this really just comes down to hopefully nothing that would be asked of in a capstone project, certainly. But if you were asked to do something by a client that may have larger impacts on the community at large, you want to take things like that into consideration when it comes to potential solutions to a problem. It could be something as small as a client asking you about waste disposal and considering, what the appropriate thing to do would be as it relates to proper waste disposal and what is allowed versus what is ethically the kind of best thing to do. Next, we will talk about teamwork and leadership, as well as the importance of adaptability and integration when solving accounting capstone projects. So with respect to teamwork and leadership, which again is a CPA enabling competency, most importantly, I would encourage you to take an active role in all team activities. So with these capstone projects, you're working with fellow students, some of which you may know well and may have worked with in other classes. In certain cases, you might be working with people that you've never had the opportunity to work with before. So remember that when you're in a group project, especially with people that you don't know very well, keep an open mind. Remember that people come to the table with different skills and strengths and opportunities. And it's important to remember to take an active role yourself and encourage other people to take an active role in team activities, to make sure that you're seeing problems from as many perspectives as possible, and delivering kind of the most complete and well-researched and well-debated and defined final product to your client. Along the way, you want to make sure that you're monitoring performance and revising plans where necessary. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the planning stage and kind of what is required of that. But specifically as it relates to teamwork and leadership, really making sure that you remember the importance of staying on top of your deadlines, making sure that you're holding yourself accountable and holding your teammates accountable to the agreed upon timelines. But making sure also that you're building in buffers and providing opportunity for the unknown to occur and giving yourself time to react because inevitably the unknown will occur and you'll need that time to make changes or improvements. Again, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that you're being mindful of team or group members' strengths and opportunities and making sure that you're taking advantage in the best way possible of each other's strengths, as well as helping each other identify and improve on your opportunities. And lastly, I would encourage you to put yourself out there. Again, if you're the type of person who is more likely to kind of sit in the corner and just kind of listen, I would really encourage you to get your perspective out there, make sure that your team members are aware of areas that you find are your strengths, as well as areas of opportunity for yourself and areas that you want to improve. If there's a particular segment of the problem that you feel you would do a really good job at, then, put yourself out there and acknowledge that this is something that you feel you would do well at. And the same for an opportunity, if it's something that you need to work on, something that you know that you require, say for the CPA, CFE or studying for the exams, don't be afraid to put yourself out there and say, can I try this calculation? And, if someone who feels really strong in that area could take a look over and give me some feedback, that would be great. Again, you're only helping yourself and helping the client by putting together a really robust and well thought out response to their problem. Again, you want to remember that flexibility will be a prerequisite here. Again, we're talking about group projects with time and resource constraints. Your students, you're going to have a lot of other things on your plate other than the Capstone project. So again, making sure that you're being flexible within reason. And making sure that you're building in buffers to allow for more flexibility. And then again, as I mentioned before, you want to consider how multiple competencies integrate within a single issue. So, if you're helping your client with a financial reporting issue, you may want to consider how that might affect an audit and assurance issue that might integrate with the financial reporting side of it. Or again, how are the taxes affected by whatever decision you might recommend? Again, thinking about how those different problems and areas can kind of intertwine, strategy and governance, finance, it all can kind of tie together within the same single issue. And making sure that you're being aware of those things will help you have the right mindset going into the problem to make sure that you're delivering a full final product to your client. Okay, so next we'll talk about the importance of making a detailed plan, which will help you analyze the issues thoroughly. We'll start by talking about defining the problem and the objectives from kind of the client's perspective as well as the group's perspective. We'll talk about gathering situational information. So this includes an assessment of the internal kind of strengths and weaknesses, external opportunities and threats, information about the economy, information about the industry, information about the particular business, that you're dealing with, any of the shareholder preferences, things like that. Then we'll talk about creating a detailed schedule, the importance of it, as well as kind of my perspective on what should be included on that schedule to make sure that everything is, all your deliverables are met. And lastly, we'll touch on kind of thinking about what the project delivery to the client looks like, even at the planning stage. Okay, so first we'll talk about defining the problem and objectives. So sometimes the problem that you're trying to solve will appear very obvious, and other times it might not be so much. As an example, let's say a client has approached you. They have had consistent revenues the past 5 years, but they've noticed that their profitability has been decreasing pretty steadily year over year. And you might immediately think, I wonder if they have a problem controlling their costs. You do a little bit of analysis, and it turns out, yep, you were absolutely right. They have a problem with their fixed costs, and this was the problem with the profitability. And you provide a suggestion as to how they can better manage those fixed costs. That might work out. It might be the case that no, actually, they're managing their costs very well, and their cost management actually really has not much to do with their profitability. It could be that the pricing model they were using doesn't align with their strategy anymore. It could be that they're having quality control issues, which is affecting their profitability. Supply chain issues that are affecting throughput time and affecting profitability. It could be any number of these things that don't necessarily appear obvious off the top, and making sure that you're taking the time to flesh out those potential things with your group members and potentially with the client will help you kind of deliver a more robust solution and again, hopefully improve everyone's satisfaction with the project. You want to consider what kind of the client's ideal outcome is for you at the end of the Capstone project. In some cases, you may be handing the final delivery off to the client for them to take it and run with. Or you may find that actually the client intends for kind of you to hand your deliverable off to another Capstone group in the next turn, who will then kind of take the project to another stage, and then perhaps another stage and another stage. Making sure that you're aware of where your work falls in the process is critical to make sure that you're actually understanding what the client's outcome is and will help you kind of deliver on that desired outcome. I kind of talked about this already, but you want to look for underlying issues. Again, are there strategy and governance issues that are causing other problems? Are there taxation issues? Are there financial reporting issues, or perhaps ways that they're managing their assets financially? There could be lots of underlying issues that are causing other problems. And making sure that you're drilling down and looking for those underlying issues, again, is critical for solving actual problems. You also want to consider time sensitivity and again, determine whether objectives are reasonable. This likely won't be the case when you initially start a project, but sometimes happens where a client will ask you for a deliverable and then a week later have this great epiphany and realize that they want to go in a totally different direction or add another entire component to a project. So just make sure that you're being open with your client and your group members about kind of what constraints you have from a time and resource perspective, and making sure that you're being clear as to whether those deliverables are reasonable. When we're talking about gathering situational information, we're talking about gathering information about the entity as a whole. So we're talking about stakeholder needs and preferences, any constraints that they have or you have to getting the job done, financial analysis, and a scan of the internal and external environment. So when we're talking about stakeholder preferences, again, stakeholders can be shareholders, lenders, government or regulatory bodies, employees, or consumers. And again, all of those stakeholders will have different needs and preferences. Shareholders might want profitability or growth, or a determination of whether a business should operate in a certain segment. Lenders primarily are concerned with whether or not they're going to be repaid or not. Government bodies, again, we're talking about tax liability or other liability for programs such as HST, reporting of employment benefits, things of that nature. Again, regulatory bodies will want to are particularly concerned with compliance. So again, the Condo Corporations Act, for example, has a specific guide as it relates to condos, the operation of condo corporations. So that regulatory body has a specific interest in kind of the goings on with condo corporations, as an example. Employees, typically, again, looking for stable employment and compensation. They want jobs that meet their expectations, both from an explicit standpoint and implicit values as well. And consumers want businesses to align with their values. Again, when we're talking about constraints, we talk about tasks and resources. So from a task perspective, it's what needs to be done in what order to make sure that the job can be done on time, and what resources are required, and again, in what order are they required in order to do the time, or in order to do the task. And again, as students, specifically when we talk about those kind of intangible resources, it's time. You have other your course load. You have other professional obligations, potentially personal obligations with your friends and family. So there are a lot of resources that need to be managed in addition to kind of the task part of what needs to be done. You could perform a financial analysis. This could be talking about performance ratios, so profitability, liquidity, debt ratios, market ratios. You could compare periods, so financial reporting periods year over year, 5-year, 3-year. You could also do industry or competitor comparison as well. In terms of the internal environment scan, you want to consider things like the mission and vision and values, any goals and targets that the company has, any key success factors that are critical to their functioning in the industry or business or segment that they do, any core competencies that they might have or might require as part of their culture, a value chain analysis, or the strengths and weaknesses of a SWOT analysis. The external environment scan could contain the opportunities and threats, again, of a SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces, so you're considering the threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, the power of buyers, power of suppliers, the intensity of competition. A pestle analysis, so political, economic, sociocultural, technological, environmental, and legislative, and a risk analysis. So those are just some examples of some situational information that you can gather that will help you plan kind of what needs to be done in order to deliver a robust final project to your client. Okay, so now I'll talk about creating a detailed schedule and how important it is to make sure that it is very detailed. When I say detailed, I mean extremely detailed. As minute of a task you can put on the schedule, I should recommend doing it. I would recommend kind of identifying the main tasks that need to be done and then dividing them further into kind of subtasks. Again, really getting into the weeds of what needs to get done in order to deliver a complete final product to your client. Make sure you're including who is responsible. If you want to include even a backup responsible, or say someone who's going to look over someone's work, so a primary and then a secondary, That's not a bad idea either, to make sure that the work that you're doing is being checked over by someone who might have that particular skill set or wants to improve. Making sure that you're including job status, whether it's complete or in process, is it delayed for some reason. Making sure that you're putting your expected start and end dates, your final due dates, and building in a buffer so that you can accommodate anything that's held up for reasons out of your control. And then include a column for notes and comments, just so you can make comments along the way that might help in future deadlines. And then lastly, when you're planning, you want to consider how you're going to deliver the final project to your client. It could be in the form of a written report, a presentation, some kind of Excel spreadsheet or quantitative analysis. It could be a working template where you're giving a client, say, a spreadsheet where they can enter in numbers and play around with sales forecasting or price models, things like that. Or it might be a combination. And being aware of how you're going to deliver the final product to your client is key, because it will help eliminate unnecessary work. As an example, if you know that you're presenting a presentation to your client as opposed to a written report, then you can spend your time crafting a presentation as opposed to taking time to really edit a well-worded document. You can spend the time practicing a presentation. Or again, if you know that a client is never going to see the spreadsheet that you used for your analysis, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time formatting that spreadsheet so it looks nice. If the only people who are going to see it are your group members, ultimately what's most important is that they can understand what's happening. And you can kind of use the time that you would have otherwise spent formatting a spreadsheet on working on the actual analysis or practicing a presentation, as an example. Okay, so we're now at the stage of the project where we're actually getting into doing the work of the project. We have made sure that we are in the right mindset, and we have created a detailed plan that considers kind of the internal and external environment, as well as the kind of goals and objective of stakeholders. Now we're going to get into getting started and doing the work. So we're going to talk about identifying assumptions, selecting the right methods and tools for the project, considering the quality of information and how it affects your analysis, and finally, conducting thorough analysis. So when we're talking about identifying assumptions, again, we're speaking more to business and industry trends. This could be anything from assuming a borrowing rate in a finance calculation. It could be assumptions based on industry trends. Again, is the industry in a growth stage or is it in decline? Is the business in a growth stage or in a stage of decline? Identifying certain assumptions will be critical to making sure that we can make sense of our analysis. Again, you want to make sure that you're then documenting and justifying these key assumptions. So for example, if one of your key assumptions is that industry sales are expected to decline 5% year over year for the next 10 years, you want to make sure that you're specifically documenting that and justifying it based on industry research that you'd completed, and make sure that you're listing the source and the date that you've accessed and things of that nature. Again, in the situation where you're presenting the pro formas to a client and they're asking you, well, wait a minute, this is showing that my sales are decreasing. Like, I don't want that. I told you I expect my sales to increase. You can then point to this key assumption and say that it's based on industry knowledge collected from, Canada.ca. And then lastly, you want to verify, corroborate, and test information. And again, this kind of goes back to stakeholder preferences. Generally speaking, the shareholders will expect to see profitability or growth. So generally, the information that they're going to give you is going to kind of support that theory. Again, this is kind of why we talked about the importance of being objective and having the right mindset going into the project so that you can think about things like this where you know that stakeholders may give you information that's biased to kind of their preferences. Making sure that you're verifying information, corroborating and testing information where appropriate will kind of help you identify those potential biases in the sources of information that you've been given. Next, you want to make sure that you're selecting the right methods and tools to do the project. There are quantitative versus qualitative tools, which I'll get into on the next slide. There are professional resources that you want to consider. And then you want to consider the purpose for each technique and analysis performed. And again, really this should have been the first point because you want to consider the purpose for each technique before you're selecting the tool. And again, that makes perfect sense if we apply it to a professional problem or a problem with our lives. If we're not considering the purpose for what we're doing, then what's the point? So with respect to tools, methods, and resources, again, we have both quantitative and qualitative resources at our disposal when we're looking to analyze and solve an accounting capstone project. And really what I would urge you to do is first kind of consider the core competencies of a CPA, both the enabling competencies and the technical competencies, and think about how they relate to your project. So specifically with respect to the technical competencies, again, we have financial reporting, management accounting, taxation, finance, audit and assurance, and strategy and governance. Now, I want you to think back to courses that you've taken in your educational experience leading up to now, where you're taking a capstone project, and think about the tools and resources that you've used in those individual courses and how they might work within your capstone project. So with the quantitative tools, again, there could be anything from performance ratios. So this is liquidity, profitability, debt ratios, things of that nature. You could do a variance analysis, so compare year over year results or compare the company you're working for against the industry or other competitors. You could do an incremental analysis to look at viability of a business segment or profitability of a particular decision, whether to continue or discontinue a product. You could do some pricing models. Again, when we're talking about management accounting, there are several different pricing models that are applicable to different scenarios. You could do a net present value analysis, discounted cash flows, budgeting, break-even analysis, return on investment, sales forecasting, and consider any tax liability and do some quantitative analysis from a tax calculation perspective. Now, from the qualitative side of things, again, you can reference the CPA handbook. This is if we're talking about standards with respect to ASPE, IFRS, the auditing standards, not-for-profits, and other standards. You can reference Canada Revenue Agency publications, again, things like for HST or employment benefits. You can reference the Income Tax Act, government databases. I had mentioned earlier, the government has a really good database for industry information that I use pretty regularly, and I find it's a great tool for analysis. You could analyze their management control systems. What kind of behavioral controls and rewards do they have for their employees that might affect their results? You can do a risk assessment, do a balanced scorecard analysis, and you can analyze the mission, vision, and values. And again, these are just some of the quantitative and qualitative resources that you can use. Again, think about courses that you've taken leading up to this moment, and think about the different things that you've used and how they might apply to the capstone project that you're currently working on. Okay, so next we're going to talk about considering the quality of information and how to conduct thorough analysis. So, when it comes to the quality of information that you're gathering, make sure that you document your sources and consider your potential biases. For example, if you read on a blog that your client that you're working for has the best customer service they've ever experienced in their entire life and their products surpass all expectations, it's important to know whether or not that blog has any affiliation with the client. It could be a personal relationship, it could be paid sponsorship. So when you're doing your research, again, you want to consider the source of information as well as any potential biases that may come from that source. When you're doing that, make sure that you're reconciling conflicting or ambiguous information. Again, if a client is giving you information and you're not sure what they mean, make sure that you're asking the question so that you're not leaving anything up to assumption that doesn't need to be. You also want to make sure that you understand what the required precision of the calculations that you're making, or if you're taking information from someone else's calculation, you want to make sure that you understand how precise they were being or what type of data sample they were working with to understand how reliable that information might be. And you also may want to consider a sensitivity analysis. So again, if the client is going to tell you that their prices are going to increase by 2%, maybe you want to do an analysis where the prices only increase by 1%, or they may increase by up to 5%, and use that information to produce a more well-rounded final product. When it comes to conducting thorough analysis, make sure that your analysis is relevant. I kind of spoke to this earlier. Make sure that you understand why you're using the tool for the job that you're doing. Make sure that when appropriate or applicable, you're using a wide range of methods. Again, in the instance where a client has asked you to evaluate an investment, there are many ways and tools that you can use to evaluate whether or not an investment should be pursued. So, for example, if you are just going to use a net present value calculation, again, it's only going to tell you whether it's a positive or negative net present value. And while a lot of times that is a main consideration, it's not always the main consideration. You want to address conflicting information. Again, I kind of spoke to this earlier. If there is a conflicting information that you can't reconcile, at least make sure that you're noting it. If you're doing a sensitivity analysis, make sure that you're kind of doing so in a way that addresses any conflicting information. And you also will want to identify alternate solutions where possible. So, rather than just giving your client one final solution, this is our recommendation. You might want to say, this would be our main recommendation, but if that's not possible for some reason, then our secondary recommendation is B. Next, we're going to talk about implementation of the project once you've kind of planned and conducted some thorough analysis. So you're going to monitor and control the process, and you're going to interpret the results of the thorough analysis that you've done. So again, we talk about monitor and controlling the process. You want to make sure that you're revising and updating the project schedule regularly, as we discussed earlier. This will allow you to respond quickly to changes in data or information. I'd also encourage that you provide your client with regular updates along the way, and this will avoid any potential miscommunication. And also encourage yourself and other teammates, hold yourself and other teammates accountable to project deadlines and deliverables. Now, when you're interpreting the results of your thorough analysis, so you're going to perform a qualitative or quantitative method or tool, you want to make sure that you're applying a general guideline and interpret the result. Again, as an example, a general guideline would be that if the net present value of a project is positive, then that project should be pursued. You want to then generate additional insight based on general implications. So again, this is kind of going back to the idea of integration. You're generating additional insight of any maybe tax implications or financial reporting implications based on the result of your analysis. You want to make sure that you're establishing and using decision criteria for your conclusion. So again, it might not be good enough that a project has a net present value that's positive. It might also need to have an IRR of at least 15%. That way, you're establishing clear criteria to help you analyze whether your final project should be recommended to your client, or to help provide very clear direction to your client as to what your recommendation is. And then again, you want to provide your client with recommendations for how to actually implement your solution that you've provided for them. Last, we'll wrap up by talking about project completion, specifically that you should consider communication barriers and make sure that you're tailoring your communication to the needs of your audience. So, with respect to communication barriers, you want to consider to be aware of the needs of your audience. You want to display adequate communication skills, whether it's verbal or written. You want to make sure that you're considering the form and medium of the communication. So again, are you developing your final project to be delivered via a live presentation versus are you planning on doing your presentation to your client over speakerphone on an unreliable cell phone connection? Make sure that you're considering those potential barriers to communication when you're delivering your final product to your client, as it'll help you display better professionalism as well as enhanced communication skills. And lastly, you want to think about any situational factors, again, background noise, and things like that, that may affect the level of communication you're able to provide to your client. Again, you want to know your audience. So when you're talking with the external client, you want to use less technical terms in some cases that you would with an internal customer. You want to be clear about the purpose of your communication and make sure that you're using both verbal and non-verbal cues for your audience to keep them engaged and to show that you're paying attention to what you're doing. Lastly, just to wrap up, I'll leave you with a quick summary of what we've discussed today. So ensuring that you're in the right mindset before starting work on a project will save time, energy, and lead to a more robust finished product. Making a detailed plan will help to manage time and resource constraints, as well as provide an opportunity to hold team members accountable. Selecting the correct tools and resources for the job and using a wider range of them will produce more reliable results. Providing regular, timely updates to team members and the client will increase your credibility and accountability. Establishing clear decision criteria will help in choosing between multiple alternatives and explain to your client why you recommended one option over another. And lastly, know your audience and anticipate communication barriers so that recommendations are more impactful. Thank you for joining this webinar today. I hope that it has been helpful, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors and future Capstone projects. Thank you.